Hey, everybody, this is Micah Lieberman with Scope, the Summit for Clinical Operations Executives. Takes place every February in Orlando and every October in Europe, specifically in Barcelona. And we just got back, actually. And I'm also the co-founder of Clinico. And Craig Martin was at Scope with us. And Craig, the keynote panel at Scope a few weeks ago was chaired by somebody you know and love, same name, Craig
Yeah.
Lipset. I know and love him too, from DTRA, and it included Heidi from the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative and Nasha Fitter from Fox G1 Research Foundation, and you and Tracey Sikora from Nord. All this incredible group of people. So before we talk about that, context is tell us who you are, because I know who you are. You're the CEO of the Orphan Therapeutics Accelerator, but quickly introduce yourself, and then we're going to talk about how you connect to that topic and why it matters.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm Craig Martin. I'm the founder and CEO of the Orphan Therapeutics Accelerator. Maybe most relevant to this, I've spent most of my career, last 20, 30 years, consulting with biotech companies. And many of those companies were ones that had developed kind of novel approaches to treating diseases and were pursuing indications in rare disease. And so through that, got involved in the rare disease community and have spent a lot of time around drug development and innovation, as well as patient communities there.
Yeah, and that's super relevant because the panel it was a great keynote panel. And, we talked about how patients can, I think the title was How Patients Can and Must Disrupt Traditional Pharma Clinical Trials, right? So we had this really amazing group of executives, really interesting people from different backgrounds. But these are people, including you, who had demonstrated ways that patient-led nonprofit organizations and disease communities are doing something differently. So before we get to that, I want to ask the first question, which is, you know, the reason we had that panel, the supposition is that something already is not going well with traditional trials. So what's wrong with traditional pharma clinical trials? There's a huge group of us working together. Things are moving forward, but everyone at Scope, it's 4,500 of just the people who are managing, designing, driving trials forward, and they care and they feel things are going too slow, right? They want to do things better. So what's wrong? What's wrong with the traditional model?
I think, first of all, it was really set up with blockbuster drugs in mind, right? The goal
Hmm.
was find a high prevalence disease, develop a drug that'll work for a good number of patients in that disease area, run it through trials and market the heck out of it. And that's not a model that works well when you're talking about drugs for very low prevalence diseases, hundreds to thousands of patients that are highly targeted around specific mutations or biological biomarkers that are relevant just to that condition area. And so I think the whole system has really struggled with that. There were some good incentives that were in place under the Orphan Drug Act and Priority Review Voucher Program and other things that encourage more companies to get involved, that eventually created a viable business model for developing these kinds of drugs.
Right.
But on the back end, the prices are 2-3 million for a single administration drug. So there's a lot of pushback from the system on that as well. So, between this system not being designed to develop drugs like this in an efficient way, and on the back end, health systems sort of struggling with the resulting high cost, you've got a model that really doesn't enable you to address rare diseases at the scale that's required, which is thousands that still have no treatments.
Right. So, okay. So you gave a really good answer. So now the the current model does not serve the needs of those particular populations, which are very small because they're a small market. However, in some ways, when you work with these communities, what's interesting is if I'm a small biotech and I'm very focused on a few molecules and a specific, I'm an expert. My whole company is set up around knowing this particular disease, this particular patient community. There is a real collaborative approach, and you have this a completely different approach versus, hey, it's another trial inside of a large company looking for a population, and it goes out in the machine. And
Right.
big pharma is very good at that. We're running a lot of trials, a lot of success. This issue of rare, ultra rare diseases is different. And you just mentioned why. It's a different model, requires a different approach. So taking into account that there is a need, and taking into account that you actually have willing and able researchers and families and patients and caregivers, they're not, it's the opposite. In a lot of trials, we are going out and we're trying to reach populations to enroll in a trial. They don't even know what clinical research is. I just got out of a call with Mark Evans from Phase, and it was, I think the number is 85%, and you saw that at Scope as well. They don't even know. This population, you often have them proactively pursuing research opportunities. They know the literature. Some of them have their own registries, their own biospecimen, tissue reg, all of it, right? They have all. So it's a completely different approach. So
Yeah.
tell me more. Tell me more about, I understand it's a small market, which creates a business challenge. We're not set up for it, even with the laws that have been passed. So what can we do? What can we do to continue to find and develop new medicines for those small communities with rare and ultra rare diseases?
Yeah, and you did mention that it is a unique environment because not only are these patients familiar with trials, they live for the opportunity to
Yes.
participate in one because that may be the only hope for
Yep.
their child or their loved one. And in many instances, it's those communities themselves that discovered the drug or that advanced the research that actually got it to a point where it could go into a clinical trial. So it's not so much the participation that's the issue, although there are some barriers there. It's really the downstream incentives and disincentives
Okay.
that in some cases were in place and we've lost. So the model used to be you would do a trial for an ultra rare disease because you could then move from that indication to another bigger indication and develop a drug that the commercial viability was much higher for in that market. And some of the restraints, let's say, that were put on that or were perceived to have been put on that in the Inflation Reduction Act and other kinds of policies made investors and companies sort of question, well, can I still do that? Can I go from rare to common? And then some of the other incentives that had been in place for if you did develop a drug, you could receive a priority review voucher for rare pediatric drugs, for example, which could carry a value of $100 million or more, which could cover the cost of development and therefore make it more feasible to develop a drug for a small population. And those things now are both in jeopardy or haven't been extended. So
yeah,
that creates a
incentives,
ripple effect further
yes,
upstream.
yeah, because also it's exciting. At Scope, we've had discussions of what can the folks in common tradition, what can they learn from the approach within some of these clinical ops teams, some of these biotechs that are focused on rare and ultra rare disease? What can we learn from them? And some of those discussions were on how they collaborate with those disease communities and those patient communities, how a lot of that knowledge already exists, but that doesn't solve the problem you're bringing up, which is a bigger one, which is incentives. That's a beyond my pay grade, but I hear you, man.
I think when you talk about what can be learned, there are some good learnings in that the patient groups that have gotten involved and directly pushed a drug through and into trials have shown the ability to do so much more efficiently and cost effectively than traditional drug developers. And regulators have similarly shown some willingness to be flexible in dealing with an ultra rare treatment recognizing that there is this urgency of need to get that drug to patients, and that, you know, you're dealing with a very small population, so you can't set up a huge trial, and you can't afford the luxury of you know, multi-year placebo-controlled trials,
Right.
when you're going to have a hard time recruiting for the placebo arm, because
Right.
nobody wants their child to not be treated if they're going to be deteriorating rapidly.
Right.
Um,
And that is an interesting point too, not the regulatory part but it's also the fact that back at the beginning when we were first started this conversation, I referenced the keynote, like, hey, what's wrong with current trials? How do we do it better? But this is an example, small group, small population in partnership, developing an asset. Sometimes that asset might have been gathering dust on a shelf at a company and may have been repurposed. So there are quite a few examples of all of these populations that have the opportunity to actually drive this forward with or without pharma, right?
yeah, I
So,
think you do see instances where patient communities or academic medical institutions are collaborating directly with CROs and
yeah,
CDMOs, in order to move a drug forward, when otherwise it wouldn't,
yeah,
because there just isn't a biotech or biopharma that's willing to make an investment, or they've been handed back a program by biopharma or biotech company because it's just doesn't fit with
all
their
right, this is
portfolio.
good. So I think I remain hopeful and the opposite as well, because you know there's multiple facets to our conversation, but I did leave the panel at scope, and I hope our audience did as well, both kind of intrigued by the discussion we had and also saying, well, what does this mean to me? I'm not in rare disease. What is, well, that's interesting. They have a model which there's pieces of it I can take inside of my large organization as well. So I think it's so relevant on many levels. Cool.
Yeah.
Well, we should, in our comments, we'll call out our fellow panelists from Scope. We should put a link maybe for the Orphan Therapeutics Accelerator, some of its members. We should put that in there as well so people know what you guys are doing. And thanks, Craig, for hanging out and chit-chatting.
Thank you.
All right, man. Good
Okay.
conversation. Thank you, Craig.